Those of you who don't know, my name is Sam Richardson, and I am the head of Special Collections and Archives. I am also the museum curator here at the university, the J. Houston Gordon Museum Curator. I would like to welcome you all to the Aileen and Jimmy S. Corbett Special Collections and University Archives. This is the reading room for the archives. And today we are honored to have Dr. David Coffey here to present his take on Tennessee in the War of 1812. The title of his talk is More Than Volunteers, Tennessee in the War of 1812. The talk is in conjunction with our more recent museum exhibit, Becoming the Volunteer State, Tennessee in the War of 1812. This exhibit was created by the Tennessee State Museum in collaboration with the Tennessee War of 1812 Bicentennial Commission, and will be displayed here at the University at Martin Paul Meek Library until October 31st. Let's give a warm welcome to Dr. Coffey.
Sam, thank you all for being here. It's a remarkably good exhibit back there if you haven't had a chance to look. It's well worth your time. Blunt, Carroll, Cook, Coffey, Crockett, Dyer, Grundy, Houston, Jackson, Sevier, all counties. Named after participants in the War of 1812. Among the counties in Tennessee, not all of them. There's a nice map in here that boldly exhibits the influence the War of 1812 had on Tennessee. Tennessee's situation in 1812 was unique, and you could almost say Tennessee was in the catbird seat to benefit from what the War of 1812 became. Tennessee was a frontier state, and it had the problems and the benefits of a frontier situation. But Tennessee also had unique concerns that didn't really apply to the concerns that were driving the war talk back east. And I'll get to that in a second. Tennessee, of course, touches the Mississippi River. The Mississippi River was very much threatened should there be a war. And not only from the British, but from the Spanish. The frontier settlements in West Tennessee, Middle and West Tennessee, were threatened by British and Spanish-aided Indian groups. Tennessee also was at the cusp of expansion. The men and women who settled Tennessee were expansionists at the core, and they were interested in further expansion. That was the draw of the frontier throughout American history. That's another theme altogether. The national narrative when it comes to the War of 1812, of course, is that the United States was forced into the conflict with the British because of the British interference with American maritime activities. They were seizing American ships, taking sailors, impressing sailors from American vessels. They were damaging American honor in short order, and things had gotten to a point by 1812 that the United States could no longer tolerate that and was forced to go to war. James Madison pursued a declaration of war to defend American honor and American neutral rights on the high seas. I won't go into those details, but that was the gist of it. But that's only half the story, or maybe even just a third of the story when it comes to Tennessee, because the War of 1812 was really 2 or even 3 different wars wrapped up into one nice, neat bundle. For Tennesseans, maritime issues didn't really play into it. The war hawks, the Tennessee congressional delegation, saw in a war with Great Britain an opportunity to move aggressively against the Indians in the Mississippi Valley and in what was called the Old Southwest back then, Alabama, Mississippi. Remnants of the 5 civilized tribes, basically. They also saw an opportunity to expand into new areas, open new areas for white civilization at the expense of the native populations who had long been settled in these areas. They also saw this war as an opportunity to move against the Spanish in Florida. And Tennesseans also participated to a lesser degree in events targeted at lopping off parts of Canada. So this was first and foremost, a war of American expansion. It was not, as our popular narrative would lead us to believe, a defensive war purely to salvage honor and protect shipping. Now this was a war for expansion, and this was an Indian war. In fact, the U.S. had already begun that Indian war with the 1811 Battle of Tippecanoe River, in which William Henry Harrison dealt Tecumseh's hoped-for Confederation a big blow. Now, that didn't stop Tecumseh from continuing to try to build a coalition of tribes across the West that would oppose white expansion. So even before the war started, there was a goal in place. And this war just gave Tennesseans and other Americans an opportunity to fulfill that goal of moving the Indians out of the way. Alabama and Mississippi, those areas that became Alabama and Mississippi, were rich, as you know, potential cotton lands. And the furtherance of the cotton economy, the slave economy, depended on settling more lands in the West. Tennesseans were in fact quite enthusiastic about this war, and that Tennessee congressional delegation gave President Madison some of his strongest support in pursuing a declaration of war. Tennesseans, Kentuckians, other Westerners, as well as those in the Ohio Valley and the Great Lakes region, were enthusiastic, again, for that primary reason of moving against the Indians. Felix Grundy, John Sevier, and other members of the Tennessee delegation became leaders in the faction in Congress known as the War Hawks, who ardently pushed for war. And, of course, you could argue that no other state benefited from the war more than Tennessee did. Even the governor of Tennessee, Willie Blount, used his executive powers even before the United States moved to organize the state militia. And again, he wasn't focusing his activities on anything the British had done or were possibly doing. He was moving against the Indians. And again, the war provided him a wonderful opportunity to pursue this goal. One of the side shows to the main show was a civil war among the Creek Nation, mostly in present-day Alabama. The Creeks were divided among a mostly peaceful accommodationist faction and a warlike nationalist faction, which became known as the Red Sticks. And the Red Sticks became aggressive in pursuing their goals of stopping white expansion. They were very much interested in Tecumseh's overall vision of a Western Indian alliance. And in pursuit of those goals, they began to lash out at white settlement and at peaceful Indian settlements. A series of depredations in Tennessee, Middle Tennessee, and present-day Alabama brought Governor Blount to action. He organized the militia, and the militia began to train and prepare for action. There was a big attack in present-day Alabama at a place that was called Fort Mims that resulted in the massacre of hundreds of white settlers. Now this definitely had an impact on Tennesseans. This is the sort of thing they had been fearing, and the sort of action that they could use to rally support for a campaign against the Red Sticks. But the Fort Mims massacre sent a shockwave throughout the West, from the Great Lakes all the way down to the Gulf. And Governor Blunt was quick to capitalize on that. The Tennessee militia at this time was under the command of, well, there were various militia units. The primary unit involved in what would become the Creek War was commanded by the militia Major General Andrew Jackson, who didn't have a whole lot of military experience to his credit at this time, but he was a name. He was an important figure, and if this War of 1812 was great for Tennessee, no man benefited more from this war than Andrew Jackson did. He and his subordinates, including John Coffey, no relation, after an abortive start that was quite frustrating, a meaningless march and retreat, march to and retreat from Natchez, Mississippi, Jackson and Coffey's forces moved aggressively against the Red Sticks in a series of engagements. They struck villages throughout present-day Alabama. This campaign culminated in the Battle of Horseshoe Bend, which involved not only the Tennessee militia, made up of, yes, volunteers, but also U.S. regular troops. And among those U.S. regulars was Sam Houston, soon to be a major player in Tennessee politics. Now, the Battle of Horseshoe Bend, which occurred in March of the very pivotal year of 1814, was a smashing success for Jackson and a devastating defeat for the Creek Red Sticks. It was, in fact, a bloodbath during which Jackson's forces routed the Indians in their fortifications, but the killing went on long after that. Pretty much every warrior in the town was killed or wounded. Several hundred women and children were taken prisoner. This was a devastating defeat, which Jackson then used to bring the Creeks to the negotiating table. The result was known as the Treaty of Fort Jackson. It resulted in the Creeks ceding millions of acres of their land to the United States. Land that eventually came under the control of Jackson and many of his cronies, much to their financial benefit. It broke the Creek alliance. It broke any hopes of a Western confederacy among the Indian groups. And it opened, for good, the areas that became Alabama and Mississippi, ensuring steady white settlement across the Deep South to the border of what was then New Spain, the Sabine River, on the western border of Louisiana. Now Sam Houston, again served with U.S. Army regulars in the 39th Infantry, was badly wounded in this battle, but was one of the heroes. And he would not participate any further in the War of 1812, but any participation, notable participation in this war, meant post-war success. Now, for Davy Crockett, it was a different experience. The man who would go on to fame and a star-crossed political career before heading off to Texas, found the Creek War to be disgusting. He was sickened by what he saw and pretty much left the war himself after the battle. But heroes were made, and Jackson was now a hero. He was a star on the rise. In fact, to such a degree that he was appointed a major general in the United States Army and given sizable command in the Southern Theater. It was Jackson's hope to move against Spanish Florida. But before that could occur, intelligence revealed that the British were aimed at New Orleans. A major expedition, in fact, was headed toward New Orleans. And it fell to Jackson to rush into New Orleans and organize the defenses of that city. What Jackson did there prior to what we call the Battle of New Orleans was nothing short of amazing. He pulled together a ragtag, literally, a ragtag army made up of U.S. regulars, a few sailors, a handful of Marines, some Kentucky militia, about 1,300 Tennessee militia under John Coffey and William Carroll. And about 500 free people of color, even a few slaves volunteered to fight with Andrew Jackson under the hope that they would earn their freedom. The British had already promised slaves that if they fought with the British, they would have their freedom. So Jackson sort of had to counter that. Whether he intended to honor that, we don't really know. Also, of course, the story goes, and it's true, Jackson was joined by a group of pirates led by John Lafitte. Pirates Jackson would normally otherwise have killed on sight. Jackson did that sort of thing. He now enlisted the pirates in his effort to hold New Orleans because, one, they knew the area. They had valuable intelligence. Two, they knew how to operate artillery better than any of the guys he had. And they had some artillery, which is even more important. And Lafitte made all that available with sort of a wink-wink, nod-nod agreement that once the battle was over, he and his pirates could slink back into the Gulf of Mexico and not have to deal with it. It was a brilliant move by Jackson, actually. And he derived a good deal of benefit from that alliance as well. But he had this. He still had this job to do, and he really called on everybody in town. And the result was, in addition to that force I just mentioned, pretty much all the males, the Creole dandies, and everybody from New Orleans. Half of them not even speaking English joined up. And the reason was not that they necessarily were allied with the United States. They didn't want the British in control of New Orleans. The Royal Navy posed a huge threat to the pirates, for one thing. And if the British came to control the mouth of the Mississippi, they could dictate all sorts of policies. And so for many, it was a choice of the British or the Americans, and they chose the Americans. Part of it was Jackson. No question about that. Jackson's leadership, his strategic vision, his ability to rely on some talented subordinates meant a lot. His Tennessee Volunteers also anchored a very important section of the line. Not to get too detailed here, but at a time when regular troops fired smoothbore muskets that were not particularly accurate and didn't have that great of a killing distance, for lack of a better term. these Tennessee riflemen, many of them carried rifles that were accurate at longer ranges, and they could prove devastating in battle, and they did. The Tennessee and Kentucky riflemen, along with the various artillerymen, did frightful damage during the battle. But as the story goes, in 1814, they took a little trip along with Colonel Jackson down the mighty Mississippi. It didn't quite go that way. They kind of came over from Mobile, actually, but that doesn't make a good song. But the British arrived in December. The feeble Navy presence there, the Navy had been pretty much dismantled by President Jefferson. There wasn't much of a Navy going against a major British invasion force. These were veterans of the Napoleonic Wars. These were guys who had just gotten through defeating Napoleon's troops in Spain, led by capable leaders like General Pakenham, Edward Pakenham, who would command the invasion force. The naval assets dedicated to this were overwhelming, so the British had no trouble working their way into the vicinity of New Orleans. But that's when it got complicated, and Jackson correctly determined the route they would have to take to get to the city, and he blocked it, long story short, using the river and a canal as flanks, a swamp that was particularly useful. He created essentially a funnel effect. The British would have to attack, and General Pakenham had obliged him. After a series of small engagements, maneuvering, the British attacked in January 1815. And it wasn't much of a battle. Within minutes, more than 2,000 British soldiers and many of the leaders were killed or wounded on the fields of Chalmette outside of New Orleans. General Pakenham among them. Jackson suffered, I believe, 13 casualties. It was one of the most stunningly lopsided victories in American military history. Especially stunning when you consider the nature of Jackson's outnumbered army, most of whom were not professional soldiers, going up against a experienced, well-led, well-equipped army from the strongest nation in the world. Pretty stunning. Pretty stunning. And of course the Tennesseans did their part. Now here's where the myth continues to grow. The Battle of New Orleans was fought after a treaty had been signed to end this war. The Treaty of Ghent was agreed to, I believe, on Christmas Eve, 1814, a couple of weeks before the Battle of New Orleans. But of course, in the days before telegraph and the transatlantic cable, still 50 years away, there was no way that word could get transmitted to New Orleans before this battle. In fact, it would be still quite a few days after the battle before anyone would hear about the treaty. So, in the treaty's main terms, the only real terms in this treaty was that the war would be settled on the basis of status quo ante bellum, the way things were before the war. That had huge implications for what had gone on so far. Now, some people mistakenly say that the Battle of New Orleans didn't matter because it was fought after that treaty was signed, and because of those terms, status quo ante bellum, it didn't mean anything. That couldn't be further from the truth. For one thing, it wasn't quite a done deal. The treaty hadn't been ratified by anybody, and if the British had taken New Orleans, I think they're pretty heavy odds they wouldn't have returned it, not without compelling reason. And that's one thing. Now, what did that treaty mean for Jackson's victory against the Creeks who were allied with the British? Did that mean that the United States had to tear up that Treaty of Fort Jackson? Well, there were those in the United States who were prepared to do that. Jackson basically said, no, it's not going to happen. And again, through the force of his personality, saw to it that it didn't happen. And they managed to make a convincing case to retain those lands. So, the Battle of New Orleans didn't mean anything, the war didn't mean anything, it was status quo, antebellum, it was a tie. Well, not quite. The war, the victory at New Orleans, gave the United States a sense of victory that it perhaps wasn't really entitled to. The war hadn't gone well for the United States in most cases. I mean, the capital had been sacked by the British just not long before New Orleans. The capital, the president's house had been burned. When they built it back, they painted it white. It wasn't a White House before that. But most of the victories that the Americans enjoyed had either been on water, on Lake Champlain, on the Great Lakes, on Lake Erie, or against the Indians. The most significant being Horseshoe Bend. Second, in terms of importance, was the Battle of the Thames up in Ontario, in which the great Tecumseh was killed. So the United States did have some things to be happy about in this war. The main thing is that this war achieved major goals with regard to Indian removal. It not only opened the Southwest, it opened the Great Lakes, it opened the Ohio Valley all the way over to the Mississippi. It ended forever any hope of an Indian confederation that could stop white settlement before the Mississippi. So this was huge. Yeah, it might have been status quo antebellum with regard to the British, but not with regard to the Indians. And that's an overlooked story. Now, the victory at New Orleans gave the United States a huge sense of euphoria. Jackson was all of a sudden a rock star. He was a huge hero, the biggest hero since George Washington. And many people held him in that sort of regard. And of course, he would go on to become a full major general in the United States Army and command the Southern District and move into Florida as he wanted to do before and got into all sorts of trouble, but that's another story another day. The main thing is that the United States came out of this war confirmed in its existence. This was for many a second war of independence. I've never quite bought that because the British never gave it everything they had. Not until the end, and then New Orleans kind of just didn't work out. But this confirmed the existence of the United States. It confirmed the independence of the United States. It confirmed the United States' hold on the Mississippi River. It opened vast new areas for settlement. It ensured that within a few years, white population would reach and then move across the Mississippi. They were already settling in Missouri. And within 4 or 5 years, Missouri would have enough people for statehood. That's another story too. For Tennessee, it was huge. not only did Tennessee have a whole new, freshly minted set of heroes, guys like Sevier and Blunt, those guys have been around a while. They had established reputations. Jackson, to a degree, had as well, but not like he had now. Jackson was now the biggest guy on the block. And Sam Houston emerged as a huge star from this war and would go on to become the governor of Tennessee, a weird, short-lived term as governor of Tennessee, before he just quit and went off to live with the Cherokees and spent most of the time being drunk before he went on to save Texas. That's another story. There's Crockett. Davy Crockett didn't like this war. He wasn't above using it. Anybody who had an association with Jackson tended to, I served with Andy Jackson. And hundreds of Tennesseans could say that. And when you could combine that with the storytelling abilities of Davy Crockett, Indian fighter, bear killer, whatever, you have a story, you're going to be somebody. Of course, he went to Texas. He didn't turn out quite as well as Sam Houston did. He famously told critics in Tennessee, "You may all go to hell and I will go to Texas." And he went to Texas and didn't come home. Then there's Jackson. Jackson went on not only to become a huge figure in American history, but he started a political revolution, or his people did, around him. He's credited with expanding democracy, expanding suffrage. Most of those things, in truth, were already in motion by the time he came up, but he was the first kind of regular guy to run for president. He was, and he's often depicted as really a barbarian, an illiterate barbarian, which is not true. He was an accomplished man in many ways, and a smart man. He was smart enough to seize the political moment, and he was surrounded by smart people. And he did change America. He definitely expanded the powers of the executive branch, almost to dictatorial proportions. It could be argued, as president, he was able to complete his Indian removal policies with tragic results, as you know. And he was able to cement the legacy that would allow for another expansion, as James K. Polk, to follow him into the presidency a few years later. And finally, for Tennessee, the War of 1812 established an identity. For a state that wasn't part of the original 13, maybe it had a little, Tennesseans maybe needed that. Tennessee was settled by a lot of veterans of the Revolutionary War. But as a newer state, this was Tennessee's opportunity to contribute, to be a part of something in it. And Tennessee as a state took every opportunity. And that legacy became, or that involvement in that war became the legacy, the volunteer state. Tennessee became famous for sending volunteers. And this wouldn't be the last time. That, of course, stuck. There's a football team with that name. I understand. But this war, if they call this the war with Spain, U.S. war with Spain, the splendid little war, and you can't really argue with that. That was a pretty good thing for the United States. But this war was really, really important, and most of our common history doesn't convey that importance, or it conveys it in a different way. When we think about the War of 1812, what is it? It's the defense of Fort McHenry, right? It's the Star-Spangled Banner. Maybe the Battle of New Orleans, but it's a Jimmy Horton song, not the battle itself. It's almost cartoonish how we deal with the War of 1812, and yet this was a hugely important event in American history, and it had long-term implications. And Tennessee played a huge role in that, as this room will indicate. And I hope you'll take an opportunity to go through there and look. I'm happy to try to answer any questions you have. I think I've about run out of time. Yes?
Oh, in terms of like the main opposition in Tennessee, political leaders, was there like a common theme to the war, to Tennessee?
Well, it was an opportunity to gain land and to move against the Indians. That's what united the Tennessee delegation.
Okay.
These were frontier guys. Indian problems and expansion had been part of their existence. Most of these guys had been born somewhere else and moved to Tennessee, and they had fought Indians or had heard about it, and they were united in the hatred of the British, or the resentment of the British. All Americans, at least south of New England, were united in that, the sense that American honor had been challenged, and so that was the first rallying call. But these war hawks, they took that and ran with it in other directions. So that's that Tennessee congressional delegation. Those guys knew what they were doing. When they enthusiastically backed Madison, they knew that they were creating an opportunity for their governor and their militia to carry out a separate war. Was there another? Yes, sir.
What about the war on the Duck River up in Middle Tennessee?
The battle there there was a raid by the Red Sticks against a community on the Duck River. That was one of those events that united the Tennessee delegation and made the attack on the Red Sticks a primary concern. And so that was an important event, because the ability to strike deep into Middle Tennessee was alarming, and the response was largely assured by that event and the subsequent massacre at Fort Mims. So it did reach into Middle Tennessee for sure. So there was some compelling. There were some compelling reasons for the Tennesseans to pursue that aggressive Indian policy. Yes?
I've got a broader military history question. It's always troubled me a little bit about the War of 1812. It kind of goes back to what you were talking about a moment ago about Jefferson scaling back the Navy,
Right.
and this sort of a democratic Republican notion of not building up military power,
Sure.
or being kind of fearing a military establishment, but also this kind of almost perpetual loathsomeness that at least some factions of the Democratic Republican Party felt towards the British.
Right.
From a strategy point of view, how did Madison propose to go to war?
Well,
And with what? And how?
Well,
was he
that's
prepared to fight it?
that's an incredibly important question. He shouldn't have. I mean, the United States was in no way, shape, or form prepared to fight that war. But if you go through American history, the United States has never, ever been prepared to fight a war. Never. And we've never gone into them very well. If you look at it, we've had to raise armies on an ad hoc basis. The Civil War was fought by volunteers. The War of 1812 was largely fought by volunteers, although there had been a minor expansion in the regular army. But there was this belief, this Jeffersonian belief, in the militia system, that Americans would stand up to defend their country in a time of need, and that we didn't need a standing army because a standing army was tyranny, was the represented tyranny. It could be used against the people. So many of the founders didn't want a standing army or a large navy because they were, they looked inward more than outward. And that militia theory works unless you decide to invade Canada, or unless you decide to move aggressively against Indians across state lines, and the militia guys go, hey, we're not going. I mean, a couple of times in the Northern campaign, New York militia twice refused to go into Ontario, and that killed two different prongs of an overall strategy. Now, that's something the Tennesseans didn't have qualms about. They were okay leaving the state if they were going to go get to clock Indians, and or fight the British, whatever it was. So yeah, it was a very flawed strategy. To Madison's credit, after this war, he goes, you know what? We need a standing army, and we need a navy. And you know, really, Jefferson's presidency. Jefferson's one of our big heroes. His presidency was outside of the Louisiana Purchase. It was pretty rough. His economic policy, his foreign policy, and his military policy was disastrous. And the United States got lucky in the War of 1812. And that's, they largely got lucky thanks to the large role that Tennessee played.
The other four Indian nations, did they align themselves with the British, or they just try to stay out of the way?
Well, that's interesting. In that Creek War, there was a coalition of Cherokee, Choctaw, and Chickasaw allies who assisted Jackson. I believe 600 of them or so at Horseshoe Bend. And they did a lot of fighting. The Indians and the U.S. regulars did much of the fighting at Horseshoe Bend, and did a lot of killing too. The Seminoles were they caused different trouble, and as far as I know, they stayed pretty aligned or unaffiliated. The British and the Spanish both aided the Red Sticks though, and that's what gave Jackson not only what he took as the authority to move against Spanish Florida, but to move against the British should he encounter British. So, but they probably could have mustered some more Indian support if they needed it. The Indians the Creeks weren't the only ones faction-wise though. The other groups had sympathetic elements on both sides. So the Indians, that's one of the great untold stories in American history. The Indians have been used very effectively by the government against each other, and this war, like all the other wars, is an example of that, and it had devastating consequences for the Creeks, because not only were the Red Sticks run off the land, the rest of the Creeks were too. The ones who had been allies and friends, they were moved off along with the Red Sticks.
Well, wasn't that true with all five civilized tribes?
Yeah.
Even though the Cherokees and the Chickasaws fought with the Americans, they were still moved off.
Yeah, it's
Almost immediately.
Man, you can go all the way up through the Apache wars. They would have never caught Geronimo without Indian scouts, and when they all came in and surrendered, every one of those Indians got moved with Geronimo and the hostiles to reservations or prisons. And so that's a sad legacy. The United States government's always been willing to use Indian help, especially against Indians, and then turns it back. David, Joe?
I thought it was a really, really good presentation. Thanks for that. I guess my question is, given that it seems like one of the primary goals of the United States in this war was, and especially Tennesseans in this war, was the seizure of Indian land and the defeat the Indians suffered in Ohio and Indiana and Illinois and in the Southwest. Why is it that the common narrative or the popular narrative excludes that as part of our understanding of this war?
Well, it's like our common understanding excludes the war on the Filipinos. It's like our common understanding excludes all sorts of, the role of black soldiers at San Juan Hill and Kettle Hill. We focus on the Rough Riders. fighting next to those guys were the black regulars from the 9th and 10th Cavalry, the Buffalo Soldiers, but that wasn't a good story. Teddy Roosevelt was. And so, a lot of our popular narrative is about the good story. And moving aggressively against the Indians isn't as maybe as patriotic as standing up to the British. I'm sure that's it, but that's our history, though. Whether we're celebrating the Pilgrims, hey, they got us through that first winter, and then we killed them. It's that we just have and I think that's probably any national history. It's kind of devoid of honesty, and that's why it's important that we talk about some of these things. But not to get too technical here, but or too traditional, but if you go to that frontier thesis idea that the United States developed as it did because of the presence of a frontier, that has a lot to do with how Tennesseans reacted in the War of 1812. They were frontier people. They had gone generations fighting Indians. It was a natural expression, and the Indians had gone generations fighting them. And that's the sad truth in American history. That's another one of those images. There was this peaceful Native American presence in the West, and they would have been fine if the evil army didn't come and mess with them. No, they were killing each other before the white man came, and they were killing each other while the white men were moving out west, and they were raiding and killing, and the Comanches were as horrible as anybody, and where I grew up in Texas, and humans are warring people, and often we're quick to go to war, and we try to use war to fix all sorts of problems, and we never learn that war doesn't fix problems. It might fix a problem here or there, but it doesn't. No one's ever conquered Afghanistan. No one ever will. No one successfully invaded Russia. Hitler didn't follow Napoleon's example. It's just war. Humans are going to fight, and the Indians were going to fight regardless of the white people being here, and the white people were going to fight each other if the Indians weren't there. It's what we do. And fortunately for the United States, we do it pretty well. Sir, did you have a question? I've gone too long. Anything? Thank you so much for being here.
Coffey, we appreciate it. Thank you.